Welcome back, everybody. Over the day, we had the opportunity to hear about the Sentinel system and what is accomplished over the last year, the steps that FDA and the Coordinating Center and data partners are taking to improve its use moving forward. We also heard about real projects and real collaborations that are beginning to operate now about using the data for more broad evidence generation. And I hate to say, but I think this last panel is probably one of the most important sessions. And the reason why is that this is the opportunity for broad stakeholders to reflect on everything that you've heard about Sentinel, everything that you've heard about its vision going forward, and the potential for using its data and resources for broader evidence generation. So for this session, we have an opportunity to hear from key stakeholders that we've invited to be on the session, but we also want to hear from all of you in the audience. So as you hear the initial reflection from our panels, start thinking about your own questions that you've had throughout the day, and this is your opportunity to provide FDA, the Sentinel Coordinating Center, and others your input into how this system is evolving. So with us on this panel are representatives from the patient community, the consumer community, providers, federal and private payers, industry, and the rest of the stakeholder group. So we're going to start off in sort of reverse order here. Stephen Makita is the Sentinel Planning Board member, Sentinel Engagement Partners Work Group lead, and a patient representative for the Duke Clinical Trials Transformation Initiative. He'll be kicking us off with a presentation. Following Steve will be Kathleen Blake. Kathy is a vice president for performance improvement at the American Medical Association. Doris Peter is director of the Health Rating Center at Consumer Reports. Fran Cunningham is associate chief consultant, PBM, and director for the Center for Medication Safety at the U.S. Department of Veterans Affairs. Paul Wallace is chief medical officer and senior vice president of clinical translation at Optum Labs, one of the data partners within Sentinel. And Patrizia Cavazzoni is senior vice president for worldwide safety at Pfizer. So with that, I'd like to hand things off to Stephen to kick us off.
Thanks, Greg. Good afternoon, everyone. It's great to be with you. Sentinel is increasingly recognized as a vital resource to support the needs of variable stakeholders, public health agencies, health systems, regulated industry, and the clinical research enterprise. However, data partner members and the general public are also key stakeholders, but they are largely unaware of three vitally important things: Sentinel's existence, Sentinel's health and safety mission, and the commitment of all of those across Sentinel to protect patient privacy. Because of this lack of awareness, a work group was formed to tell Sentinel's story better and more broadly. Next slide, please. The Engagement Partner Work Group is tasked with two overarching goals. First, create a plan of action to heighten awareness about Sentinel by telling the story of Sentinel and including within that narrative examples of its successes and its present and future value added. Second, to communicate that story effectively, our work group will develop a variety of customized messages and tools so that the story reaches a variety of target constituencies. Next slide, please. Thanks. This slide is what I refer to as my dream team of engagement partners. As you can see, reflective in our work group are leaders from the FDA, data partners, confidentiality and privacy experts, and Affinity patient advocacy disease groups. It's a privilege for me to lead this work group and especially to work closely with Rich Platt. Next slide, please. As part of our work to develop the message and tools, we first have to identify what is the story of Sentinel that will reach the public, the patients, and each of the engagement partners. In developing those messages, the work group has identified the following 6 considerations. What do patients and the public want to know? What matters to them? Patients and the public have been shown to be enthusiastic about sharing their health data so long as they see their contribution actually makes a difference in their lives and other patients' lives, and their privacy is not compromised. It is important, as part of Sentinel's story, to recognize and then publicize the fact that Sentinel is an important tool in FDA's toolbox to keep patients safe and to provide effective treatments. But it is certainly not the only tool utilized by FDA to ensure safety and effectiveness. As part of that story, we want to make sure that we highlight why Sentinel is so successful and what are the benefits that it has already produced and what are the potential future benefits. And finally, in telling that story, we don't want to encumber the story of Sentinel by referencing data and analyses that might be of interest to certain engagement partners, but are really overly complicated and distracting from the primary narrative, which is Sentinel. Next slide, please. To guide the development of Sentinel's story, we agreed on the following 7 foundational principles. Remove the element of surprise. No one likes to be caught by surprise. It causes an array of emotions and reactions. We want to avoid surprising individuals, that their health data are being captured and analyzed, and remind them that this is being done in a way which does not identify them as individuals. By telling Sentinel's story, we want that story to engender trust among the audience who's been uninformed about its benefits and values. We want to be open about what Sentinel is, how Sentinel works, and why it is important to the health and safety of Americans. To be an effective story, and in order to build trust, we must show that Sentinel is relevant and meaningful. But the story, first and foremost, has to be effectively communicated and understood. We can't get bogged down in using unfamiliar, complicated, and sophisticated terms that the public neither understands nor cares to understand. Next slide, please. Thanks. I believe this chart accurately portrays both the collaboration and the interdependence of our work group and its charter. All of us around the table are relying on each other to connect, harness, and convey the unique roles played by each partner to create an effective, relevant, understandable story about Sentinel. Next slide, please. Now, this is one of the most important slides in this entire set. It accurately describes our composition, our mission, and our strengths. Ideally, all of us are engagement partners and play important roles as part of this team effort to heighten awareness by creating a collaborative and coordinated communication strategy. Second, we recognize that not one size fits all. To tell this story effectively, we understand that there are different audiences possessing different interests and needs regarding Sentinel, and therefore the messages that we must develop must be targeted and tailored to those different audiences. Third, we also recognize that to effectively engage and communicate Sentinel's story will require the understanding the engagement partner's needs and to leverage the unique roles and strengths of each partner around the table. It's important to note that although the engagement partners will help in crafting, advising, and tailoring the story of Sentinel for their respective constituencies, the ultimate story here is Sentinel's story, and thus the ultimate most critical storyteller is Sentinel. Undoubtedly, the engagement partners may help in disseminating that story, but this truly is Sentinel's story to tell. Next slide, please. Now, before describing the unique roles, communication channels, and limitations we've identified of the engagement partners comprising our work group, again, I want you to remember that graphic that we showed 2 slides ago. Please keep that in mind as we review the contributions and limitations of each member of our team. With respect to the FDA, its unique role in Sentinel is to set and promulgate the agenda for the types of studies that will be pursued. Another unique strength is FDA's national reach. It is broad, wide, and strong. In considering FDA's communication channels available to tell that story, we identified the following: FDA's official announcements, its public website, the Sentinel Initiative website, MedWatch, and referencing Sentinel in medical journals and publicized reports. And of course, each engagement partner understands its limits to telling that story. FDA channels are not frequently accessed by the average patient, and therefore FDA's message has limited scope. Next slide, please. In turning to the second engagement partner at the table, let's consider the unique role, communication channels, and limitations of the data partners. The data partners play a critically unique role of being Sentinel's data resource. The data partners communicate with their members through a variety of media. We've named 4 here. And yet, the data partners do recognize 2 obvious limitations. Their top priorities when communicating with members are to help members navigate the often confusing terrain of healthcare and healthcare expenses. The other priority is arming members with information on healthy living and condition management. They have many communication priorities, and the population that doesn't particularly desire to engage. So, Sentinel is a different kind of message, and this story is going to compete with other communication priorities of the data partners. Next slide, please. It is undeniable what a unique and trusted role and resource that providers and provider groups play and can play in messaging Sentinel. They are a recognized, trusted source, and patients, for the most part, rely on them to convey information about the safety and effectiveness of therapies. The communication channels naturally are the face-to-face interactions that really stand at the centerpiece of the physician-patient relationship. But in this increasingly media-savvy and driven world, some provider groups interact through other media. Of course, the limitations of relying on providers to tell the story of Sentinel disrupts the context and nature of that relationship. Time is of paramount importance, and relying on clinicians to help message Sentinel may inhibit this treasured relationship by requiring a new conversation about what happens if something goes wrong. Patients rely on clinicians to reassure them that the intervention will work. Likewise, providers need to believe that the drugs and devices they prescribe are safe. Next slide, please. The final engagement partner, affinity groups, meaning patient advocacy, disease, and age groups. Equally important in their knowledge of audience and capacity to tell the story. Affinity groups feature in-depth experience about certain diseases, conditions, and age groups. Their members trust them, and they have a real strength in being able to mobilize their respective and attentive audiences. They are media savvy and visible to their members. However, in telling Sentinel's story, affinity groups' audiences may not deem such a broader scope message with the same importance as those traditionally associated with these groups. Therefore, the issues of generalizability and representativeness are in play. Next slide, please. In summary, our work group will further elaborate over the next year its plan of action and then devise a coordinated communication strategy which embeds messages, tools, and dissemination best practices. In this second phase, we will also contextualize the story and media to produce a coordinated, understandable message about the inestimable value of Sentinel to a healthier and safer future. Next slide, please. Special thanks to both Susan Farrow and Sophia Axman at Harvard Pilgrim, who provided rich, and particularly me, with their tireless efforts and insights. I could not lead this project without them. Thank you very much.
Great, thanks, Steve. We'll now turn to Kathy.
So I'd also like to thank Steve and his comments, as with many of the things that have been said throughout the day. I think it's true for all of us. It just stimulates more thoughts about how we can drive participation. And I would first say congratulations to all of those who've been involved in bringing Sentinel to this point, and that it's particularly wonderful to see that name Mini, that first part of the name taken away from it, and maybe you should say Mighty instead of Mini. The second part is I think we all read a lot about the challenges of using big data. Certainly we're very focused on that at the AMA in terms of what is the big data that's needed to improve healthcare and fulfill our public health mission. And it is something where I think that the future is here now. And I think that Sentinel has helped lay out that path. And that although you have laid out the path and you've set a very high bar in terms of the gathering of partners, the 190-some million patients, you've laid out the path for other initiatives. And I think we heard that with Joe Selby's comments with respect to PCORNet and patient-powered research networks. I'm Also particularly focused in my work on the National Medical Device Evaluation System. And I'll be honest, we are going to steal shamelessly and often from all of the lessons that you have learned with Sentinel. It is something where you've forged the path. So let's talk a bit about clinicians and what is it that clinicians want. And maybe as I was jotting my notes, I thought about food because it was after lunch. So we are inundated with information, and if information were food, then we would all be popping out at the seams and we would be morbidly obese. And so what's needed is, instead of this massive amount of information that inundates us, we actually need well-curated a menu, a selection of information that groups like this one have decided is information that we should be paying attention to. So well-curated information is, if I were to think of this as jobs, this is your job. And it's really all of our jobs, but I'm going to assign it there. And then what we want, clinicians want, and I'm using that word in its broadest sense, is that we actually want you to identify, as you clearly have in areas such as anticoagulation management, hepatitis C management, we want you to tell us what are the gaps. Because once we know about those gaps and that word is out there, then our job really begins, which is how do we close the gaps? And so in my area, which is performance measurement and improvement, the way that we do that is we look, is the problem important? I think no argument about Hep C, no argument about AFib. Very important, need to solve it. Secondly, we then look at, are there ways to solve that problem, to close that gap? And if there are ways, then we develop performance measures that allow us as clinicians to track our performance, report on our performance, and be able to compare how much progress we are making or not making in terms of closing the gaps. So that will be our job. And then we will want, for programs like Sentinel, to look at the population level and say, as a nation, are we closing that gap, as has been done in so many different areas already. In terms of other opportunities, I would say that as we look at new payment models, those involve certainly much more focus on use of electronic health records, performance measurement, and quality improvement. We are going to be hungry for opportunities to improve quality. And so what you learn with Sentinel will help us do that. If I were to say what are some of the asks that I would make of this very, very productive enterprise, one of them would be, please keep pushing to make electronic health record data usable. That there's a lot in the press about physicians' unhappiness with electronic health records, no question, but I'd remind you that there is good data, we've collected it with the RAND Corporation, showing physicians will not go back. They want their EHRs to stay as part of their practices, but they want their EHRs to be more usable. The other ask that I would have is that you not neglect, and I don't think that you will, but it merits emphasis, don't neglect registries. That several of the slides today talked about registries, but from the physician perspective, increasingly we will be measuring the quality of our care and the ability we have to close those gaps through qualified clinical data registries. And there are now over 43 of them. They are generally managed by specialty societies that then report the data to CMS, but absolutely critical that we have registry data models and opportunities. And then just lastly, in terms of the last panel, and as I wrap up, I know that there are a lot of issues with respect to resources, but I would say that the comments that were made about there being value for everybody are very important. And I would just pose as a challenge for this group is to say, are we at the point, going back to the meal analogy, of can Sentinel, now that it has fed, so to speak, fish to the people, Are you at the point where you are ready to teach a much broader group how to fish? And if the broader group is able to fish, then some of the resources and the challenges and the demands, instead of always being brought to FDA or always being brought to Harvard or always being focused on one or two entities, become much more distributed. And so I would ask you, as you go forward with your work, think about when you are ready and get ready to teach us how to fish. Thanks.
Thank you, Kathy. We'll turn it to Doris.
Thank you. Hi, thanks for inviting me today. I'm Doris Peter, Director of the Consumer Reports Health Rating Center, and we have a long-running project at Consumer Reports related to the safety, cost, and effectiveness of drugs called Best Buy Drugs, and that's one of the reasons why we have a big interest in learning more about Sentinel and seeing how safety data from that initiative can help us in communicating with consumers. So the Sentinel program is very ambitious, and I really congratulate everybody working on it, especially the researchers and the analysts who are actually having to deal with the day-to-day work on the claims data and the EHR data, which is incredibly difficult. And thanks for all that hard work. I think one thing I want to point out is, though, I kind of feel like the original use case of finding safety signals, adverse event signals, has sort of been glossed over, and that use case hasn't been delivered on yet. So that's what we want FDA to make sure not to lose sight of that. There's all these great ideas about what else Sentinel can do, but let's have Sentinel do what it was meant to do to begin with, was to find those safety signals, in the data as we go forward. And I understand the methodologic issues, and it seems like that's being moved forward, but I think it's important to address that. The point I brought up about data, we're really concerned about the actual integrity of the underlying data. So you can have really great methods, but if the data underlying it are inaccurate or are not valid, you will never get the right answers. And so both the combination of claims data, which we work with also and is incredibly problematic, and EHR data being even more problematic, I think overselling that can be a real problem. And so I think being more transparent with the community, including at these meetings, to even have a session on challenges and show us what sort of validity studies are being done, where are the challenges, where have you run against roadblocks, and how will we solve those? Because it's great to be positive and excited about all these opportunities, which I am too, but if we don't all know what the problems are and how they can be overcome, then it seems like it's being glossed over. So I would encourage that. Let me see. I wanted to say not to oversell Sentinel to the public. It's good to tell the Sentinel story, but I think to be straightforward about what it can and can't do at the moment is important. We also don't want to replace manufacturer post-marketing trials with Sentinel. We're really concerned about that, given the limits, again, of the data and the methods. I think it's over-reliance on Sentinel to do that. There may also be a desire to try to replace some clinical trials, the pre-marketing studies, with Sentinel data, which is also a real danger. It amounts to basically treating patients and consumers like guinea pigs, proving drugs with very limited studies, and then looking later to see if there are any adverse events, and that's really dangerous. So I think it's a good balance between getting what we can out of big data, but realizing where we can't replace clinical trials. From the governance point of view, we wonder actually what role the public can play in asking questions of the Sentinel database. So can we actually ask a question, and will FDA consider that in their decision making about what the priorities are? And then we also encourage FDA to reach out to organizations like ours in terms of communicating what Sentinel has been doing and what it can do, because I think we can be good translators of that for consumers. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Doris. Fran Cunningham. Hi.
Thank you for inviting me. I'm going to speak today both from a VA healthcare system standpoint as well as from a safety center point of view. Really the latter, because we've been involved with FDA as federal partners since Sentinel Initiative's inception. And I can say, and I can only reiterate, and commend the amount of work that Sentinel has done. And just to see its growth and what's happened in the past 8 years is, from my standpoint, phenomenal. And it's just a pleasure to see more and more done every year. And today, just seeing some of the future uses or future things that are going to come out of it. So I'm getting probably a bit more excited than what I should be. So I'm going to speak today, and I'm going to cover 3 points. Sentinel as it's currently used, Sentinel's future use, and then lastly, and unfortunately, some degree of limitations. So with its current use, what would a system like VA, what does VA get out of looking at Sentinel today? And VA, as you know, is a healthcare system, but also has a very, very strong research component, both from a clinical trial standpoint as well as observational. And over the past 8 to 10 years, very much so from a surveillance standpoint, medications, and over the past couple of years, a bit more with vaccines. And when we conduct our surveillance, we're conducting it primarily for knowledge and use for our veteran population. And our veteran population tends to be complex chronic care. So we're a tiny piece of the pie, but drugs behave slightly differently in that patient population. So we need to look at things maybe slightly differently than other groups, and even in certain instances, even FDA. And so typically when we conduct our surveillances, we're conducting it in real time to make imminent decisions. And with those imminent decisions come actions from guidance and use, from criteria or guidances that are developed at a national level for policy. Increased utilization. Before we had our surveillance system, some of the drugs that came onto the market weren't used for a long period of time in our system because they weren't known to be safe. So we've been able to increase utilization of drugs at a much more rapid point of view, much more rapidly. And then in certain instances, decrease utilization when we've seen that it's not necessarily safe in our patient population because of complex chronic care. So what do we get out of Sentinel now? Well, we can compare some of the things that we're doing. When Sentinel, and they're doing things pretty quickly, which is really good, we can look to see what the results are in our data set that Sentinel has. And a lot of times we're like, great, we did it right, this is a good thing. And in some instances it may be slightly different, and we're like, okay, what's the difference and why? And then secondly, because of our patient population and because certain drugs may not be utilized as rapidly as I'd like to see them utilized for reasons I can't even discuss right now, we need to see information for drugs that we know are used in our system, but we just don't have enough of the information to even track it ourselves. And so we've been able to look at some of the results that Sentinel has published or put up as part of their summary of projects they've completed. And it's really helped us go back and say, look at what they've done. This drug can potentially be used in our system. They're coming to us from a medication safety center. We're usually the people that are responsible for going back to our group as a VA healthcare system and saying what is safe and not safe to use. So that's Sentinel's use as it's currently, and I don't think I'm just very happy with how it's currently being used. So what about future uses? From a healthcare system, an area that I've heard today that I think can definitely help with healthcare is the guidance program. VA is an evidence-based system, so a lot of the decisions, quote unquote, needs to have evidence there. And with certain drugs, the evidence is not there, especially when we want to look at head-to-head, when we're looking at effectiveness. So anything that can be done more, it looks like this guidance program will have that done. I'm excited to see that, more effectiveness studies, and I do understand the limitations of those. By all means, I understand the limitations, but it will be interesting to see Sentinel do more of that. I know that VA, we have a point-of-care clinical trial where we specifically, it was a couple of us in our group that specifically asked for 2 old drugs to be compared. And a lot of times it's older agents that need to be compared. So I think as a system, sometimes it's not always important to do the new best thing. And it's important to do some older things that have uses that are still very good that need to be assessed. And I think as Sentinel moves forward, you need to think about that. It may be some of the older drugs that need to be looked at. Another area that I know and was listening to today was the signal detection, and I'm just extremely happy if that comes to fruition, okay? And I definitely understand from a regulatory standpoint and signal detection, but let me tell you about an area from a healthcare system standpoint. We're a national healthcare system, hate to use the word, but that's what we are. And I'm running out of time, so I'm gonna go quickly. But often we are mandated to have transitions of drugs. We have an entire therapeutic interchange, and when that happens, we need to monitor quickly what potential adverse events may occur with this mandate. And so I think signal detection when therapeutic interchanges are made are going to be very important. So I'd like to, think about that signal detection being used for Sentinel, if that's not already a thought, to maybe think about that. So lastly, I'm going to talk about limitations. And a lot of the limitations have already been discussed, so I won't mention that. But there is one that I will reiterate, and that is validation of outcomes. And what we've noticed with our data is we don't have to validate everything, but with certain things we do. And we're very happy when things come out the right way. But what happens when it doesn't? And how do you address those particular issues? And I think that's something that Sentinel will have to think about as they begin to do more and more projects, consider using more real-time validation in the future. So lastly, as this program is excellent, continues to grow, and I see future use for Sentinel, especially from our standpoint, one of the things I think we have to remember is that Sentinel, as it exists and as it will be, it's going to be excellent, I know, but it won't be a panacea. And so we're going to have to remember that everything that shows bright promise also has some risk.
Great, thanks, Fran. Next is Paul.
Well, I always wanted to first thank for the invitation to be here. I've been a fan of Sentinel from my Kaiser days. I hung out in Kaiser for about 25 years, and I think when I first met Sentinel, it could have been micro Sentinel. It's been amazing to watch it grow. But I think what I particularly admire about it, my roles have always been thinking about how you stand up infrastructure for creating knowledge and getting it into practice. And I think that the work that's been done here is really quite remarkable. And the technology is cool, but the social engineering is really outstanding. And I think that the ability to actually create collaboration, the approaches to governance, and also the move into thinking about sustainability are really sort of setting the curve. So I think folks here are really to be recognized. As an old quality improvement guy, I've always been kind of envious of the safety folks too, because they've always had a really compelling message and a really compelling value story, and I think that you've leveraged that really well. I think also that the challenge now as we think about how does this have broader applicability is really an interesting challenge, and it's one that I think is shared by many different groups. So I wanted to tell you about our experience in another infrastructure provider, Optum. I think folks probably immediately equate Optum with United. Optum is part of United Health Group. It's a totally separate set of companies, though, from United Healthcare. United Healthcare are the benefits and insurance companies that take care of about 1 out of 6 Americans. Optum is a set of services, companies, and technologies. Think of it as being an infrastructure provider that has business relationships with, frankly, every aspect of American healthcare. Every hospital in America, every health plan in America has an Optum relationship. So it's a relatively broad-reaching group, and we do participate in Sentinel as a vehicle for providing United Healthcare data to be part of that. Another, though, group that I wanted to talk about is the group that I work most closely with now, which is a new group called Optum Labs, which has been around for about 3 years. Optum has about 80,000 employees, 40 of whom work in Optum Labs. And our mission is really to set up a research and innovation shop to think about how we can make available in a broad way a variety of Optum assets, mainly around data, but also creating partnerships. And the genesis of this really actually, to Kathy's point earlier, came from Mayo, saying about 3 or 4 years ago, what are we going to have to do to really industrialize the ability to use data for asking critical questions and running our enterprise, and who are our partners for that? But they also recognized early on that there were going to be some critical requirements. One was going to be a boatload of data. The second was going to be multiple partners that came from across the healthcare enterprise. And the third was going to be really being purposeful about design, to see publication as good, but seeing translation as inescapable, and designing with that in mind. So that's really been the genesis. And now we have, I'll tell you about the data in a second, we have about 25 partners. Perhaps most notable is HHS. We now have a vehicle for any HHS investigator to actually use the data resource for asking critical questions. And there is a gating process within HHS. But the data resource reflects claims data on about 140 million people going back over 20 years, largely United and United acquisitions, but importantly also includes EHR data that comes through our subsidiary Humedica that now represents about 45 million lives, and there are now 80 million lives under contract that will be in the database by the end of the year. What Humedica does, in short, is to work across EHR platforms to be agnostic of EHR platform, pull data out of EHRs from structured and unstructured fields and put it into a common database. So there is actually a common data model for looking across 85 million lives in EHRs. There's also a great deal of learning about the utility and disutility of using that volume of EHR, a lot of which has been alluded to today. And we make this data available to investigators in a secure enclave in a de-identified form, but we can also link at the individual level because the data that we receive from our data donors is systematically de-identified in the same way, and we can link across de-identified identifiers. So it's not statistically linked, it's directly linked. And we also have brought in about 40 million lives of consumer data. So you can imagine this is a relatively robust resource for being able to look at a whole range of problem formulations. There have been about 130 projects that have been executed within the data. About 30 of them have been published. 70 of them are actively under investigation now and probably have increased the efficiency of that inquiry across a broad number of problem formulations. The two things that I really wanted to highlight, though, that I think we've encountered that I think are going to, that I've also heard here and that we're going to have to think collectively about how we address. The first is combining data sets. It's sort of like, in many ways, I think that claims data is almost like unidimensional. I mean, we've had 40 years of torturing claims to figure out how to get information out of it. And, when you start thinking about EHR data, it is so multidimensional, it is so messy, and it's so rich that we really have to take a step back and decide whether the things that have worked with claims data are really going to get us there. Do we really need to think about this a little bit differently? And is it really going to be able to be reduced to a common data model, or are we going to have to be more flexible? So I think thinking about the messiness, but also the opportunity of being actually more thoughtful about it, I think it's Rumsfeldian in a sense. We have to just recognize that the known knowns are minuscule, the known unknowns are growing daily as we try and use it, and we're going to spend the next decade peeling through the unknown unknowns around how to use clinical data. The same is going to apply to registries. So I think it's going to have to be a parallel processing exercise involving many parties is sort of my bias. And I would have you think about what we're doing in the labs, because we're also working off of a combined data model instead of a distributed data model using de-identified data, that there's complementarity where we can share learnings and think about what are the environments where perhaps distribution isn't optimal for being able to do some of the things that we'd like to do. The last comment I wanted to make is actually along that line. As we think about from the patient perspective or the clinician perspective, as we want to move from efficacy to effectiveness, just being able to expand the denominator to everybody isn't going to be enough. We really have to shrink the denominator to an N of 1 so that the advice that we're providing is what does it mean for me as an individual. So if I'm taking NOACs and I'm over 75, not everybody bleeds, but more people bleed. Which people over 75? And how are we going to know that? And is that going to be data we can get out of trials? Or are there opportunities using approaches like data science and using clustering and using a variety of different approaches that are hypothesis generating but can be linked then to clinician review to think about, can we actually create personalization? Simplistically, what we think about is using, if we're an N of 1, we want to know what is it that makes us unique? What's the data picture that reflects our uniqueness? And then how many N's of 1, just like the one in front of us, can we find as an analytic subset to find out what would work best for that group of patients? And decision support begins to look like, when a doc like me sees a patient like you in a community like ours, this is probably what would work best. So that's really aspirational. I think it's going to take us a few years to get there. I think the data is actually the pathway to get there, but it's going to take all of the things that I think you have demonstrated so well around, on one hand, the technical aspects, but I actually think the rate limiting steps are going to be more of the social engineering.
Thank you, Paul. And last but not least, Patrizia.
Or sharing microphone. I have the unenviable position of being the last speaker of the day, standing between you and probably all sorts of modes of transportation or more fun things. So I will try to be as concise as possible. First, let me thank Mark and the organizers for inviting me to be here today. I feel additional pressure since I'm the only industry speaker today. And I've also had an opportunity to follow through my work in industry, which has been largely in safety, the remarkable evolution of Sentinel and more recently also the remarkable evolution of IMEDs, as I have had the pleasure and the privilege of being one of the 2 industry representatives in on the IMED steering committee from its very onset. So, today's proceedings, first and foremost, have a celebratory quality, and I really share in that because we have come such a long way since 2008 and since the inception of IMEDs. They really have highlighted the growing importance of real-world data, and we heard it from all speakers, as an essential element of a safety surveillance system, no matter which stakeholder conducts safety surveillance. And in particular, as we heard earlier today, the expanded use of real-world data will facilitate the evaluation of important questions about safety of marketed drugs with greater speed and efficiency. And that's very important to patient, prescribers, and society. So why do Pfizer and other companies advocate that the Sentinel network should be made accessible to industry? The fundamental reason, in fact, the only reason, is that pharmaceutical companies have the legal, ethical, and societal obligation to conduct surveillance in a continuous fashion for their marketed products and also for their products in development. And so we see Sentinel as a very important additional tool to expand the arsenal, the multimodal arsenal that we have to conduct post-marketing surveillance. While FDA and regulatory agencies conduct post-marketing surveillance, industry and pharmaceutical companies do too, and we do that continuously. We do it by evaluating all sorts of data. And this includes, obviously, signal refinement, protocol-based evaluations, as well as the promise of utilizing Sentinel for signal detection. And I really share Fran's comments from earlier on. Another area of particular interest is the utilization of Sentinel to evaluate the impact of risk minimization measures on prescriber behavior. And you heard earlier on from Troy that one of the pilots in IMED's evaluation actually addressed that particular question and area. As we add more tools to the safety surveillance toolbox, however, we also need to be prepared to evaluate the effectiveness of this increasing array of surveillance modalities. Up until now, both regulatory agencies and industry have taken an additive approach to surveillance. As new tools become available, we add them to the toolbox. As we evolve towards a national real-world data infrastructure, the time may come where it may be necessary to evaluate which modalities for surveillance and which data sources might need to be at the core of the arsenal, and which might need to be superseded by approaches that are more novel, more precise, and more informative. And certainly as we utilize more and more EHR and claim data, that time may well be approaching. As I said earlier, looking back to 2008, the progress has been really remarkable. And certainly I am personally very excited, and many in industry are excited about the roadmap that has been established for Sentinel and more recently for IMEDs. We also heard today about the important role of public-private partnership, and in particular, Reagan-Udall and IMEDs as a nexus where FDA, data partners, and industry come together to explore ways to expand the utilization of Sentinel for surveillance of post-market products. In an earlier panel, Troy McCall described the IMED's evaluation pilot that Pfizer had the privilege to sponsor. And before I get further into this aspect, I really want to emphasize the collaborative nature and the partnership that was at the core of being able to conduct this panel, and to thank our partners, the data partners, the Harvard Pilgrim, IMEDs, and everybody who participated in this pilot, because it really takes not a village, it takes a city, and it takes a lot of collaboration. The FDA, however, is key in setting the overall direction that all the partners and stakeholders will need to take within public-private partnership, because we all have the same goal. We may tackle it from different directions, but the goal is fundamentally the same. We want to find safety signals as quickly as possible. We want to evaluate them as quickly as possible with as much precision as possible. From our standpoint, the evaluation pilot met all its goals. As you heard, we ran 2 queries, relatively simple queries. I will not go into detail because I'm getting the time up sign. You heard from Troy, and I cannot do better than Troy in sort of describing what we actually did in the pilot. However, a major achievement was the development of policies and procedures to define roles, responsibility, and rules of engagement. This is really a fundamental aspect of this pilot and probably the more important. An important aspect of this was the fact that we established a framework and a time frame for communication of results predicated on fully transparent processes, timelines, and outputs. As with all pilots, we also found opportunities for refinement and for future work. And that includes ways to facilitate all of the data partners' participation. We also generate questions about the utility of public health designation for the safety surveillance work done through IMEDS. We heard about it earlier as well. The importance of gaining access to a continuum of analytic modalities within the Sentinel network. This emphasizes the importance of both the evaluation and the methods work that is taking place in the network and within IMEDS. The speed of triage of the request for queries. And I want to sort of linger on this point for the last 30 seconds, I promise. As we anticipate that more companies will be interested in running pilots and looking ahead to an eventual full production phase through the work that IMEDS is doing, we'll really need to make sure that IMEDS, the coordinating center, and data partners are able to and are enabled to ramp up their capabilities so that they can provide a scalable model. So let me summarize that overall, the IMEDS evaluation pilot was a great success, and we're really grateful as a company to have had the opportunity to be part of this tremendous collaborative network. And really, we have been able to demonstrate that a non-FDA stakeholder can work collaboratively with the relevant partners to direct queries into the Sentinel network. And we also validated the readiness of some processes while bringing to light some opportunities for more testing and refinement. So thank you for your attention, and thank you to my co-panelists.
Well, thank you, Patrizia, and thank you to all of our panelists. If I sort of think back, I'm going to ask a couple of questions, but I do want to invite the audience to the speakers or the microphones as well. I would like to start off with going back to, I can't think of any better presentation to kick off this full panel as the one that Steve gave. And the two sort of phrases that stick with me that he said were the story of Sentinel and no surprises. And I think back to all of the stuff that we heard this morning, just the litany of activities that are happening under Sentinel. Rich put up several slides of example actual safety queries that FDA is running on the system. Kevin is complaining about his smokestacks at Health Corps that are in full speed ahead. That as a data partner, they're really working hard and doing a lot of activities. And then Sentinel's been going on for 8 years, so that's 8 years worth of developing tools, methods, validating the tools and methods, asking the questions, what can claims data be useful for? What questions can't claims data be useful for? Which sort of stimulated the need to go and get more clinically enriched data. So lots of activities. that are happening. And then Paul, brought up an interesting concept of 40 years of experience with claims. And it'd be interesting to know what the number is if you add up all of the years of experience with claims that each of the data partners have, and what is that aggregate data partner years of experience that they actually brought to the system. So then what is the story of Sentinel? That's a great question, and it seems like Steve's approach with the work group is a very thoughtful, methodologic approach to really understanding what is the message that really matters to patients and how to communicate that, because no surprises is important. Nobody wants to be surprised at what my data were used for, tell me again. So being able to communicate to patients and consumers and providers about what Sentinel is all about is a tough question to ask, and I applaud the work group for taking that on, and I'm happy to have all of the panelists on this to sort of react to this. But we hear data partners. I think of my own health insurance company. You get lots of things in the mail. I don't open them all, and so if one of them happened to be something about Sentinel, I assure you I wouldn't have read it. The communication between providers and their patients is such a time. There's so little time, so much to communicate. It's a correct limitation to say that then asking providers to also talk about Sentinel is a challenge too. So the question is, what is the right way to communicate this? And I didn't hear I didn't hear the answer from Steve, but I suspect that the work group is approaching coming up with reasonable approaches. So maybe I'll turn it to Steve. Anything that's coming up to at least seem to be promising approaches to not communicate specific results, but communicate the program to minimize surprises to patients. What seem to be the most promising tools, if you will, and then maybe I'll ask some of our other panelists from their perspective what they think might be things to consider.
Well, thanks, Greg. Yeah, it's a tall order. It's a heavy lift. I think that we've got the right people at the table. We're going to do it very deliberately and thoughtfully, and we do spend a lot of times on our calls asking tough questions that don't always have easy answers. I think that we're early on in the project. I think that we will start devising certain messages for the people around the table to consider and to have them reinterpret that for us. I think that, again, the point needs to be made that, they are informing us as to what they believe are the important messages to convey to their constituencies, and they've also been candid as to what their limitations and barriers are and some competing priorities. So I think that right now, what our task is to identify what the key messages are of Sentinel, draw feedback from all of those around the table, and then be sensitive to the fact that not one size fits all, and that we must be very, very deliberate and thoughtful in how we present this. Because, as from a patient's perspective, this is such an important endeavor, and it has such astounding possibilities. So we do understand that it's complex, Greg, but we also understand that the bottom line is people are going to get safer, more effective treatments. And there's a lot of buy-in behind that general theme. So we're really looking forward to it, and we'll report back. I hope that's somewhat responsive, but if
Yes.
I'm an attorney, if you want to object, you can register your objections.
Thank you, Steve. So, Kathy?
So I might just add to that my suggestions would be have a few good stories, short, sweet examples that show in specific instances where it has made a difference, because then that could also be accompanied by information or basically the blurb that is available to be able to give to patients as they come into your practice, to be able to say, did you know about Sentinel? And here's what it is, and if you want more information, here's where you can go. And I would see that as being a generalizable approach that could be applied, for example, to post-market surveillance or actually evaluation of medical devices. AMA did a study at the time of Hurricane Katrina, and I was thinking of it as Steve commented about the differences amongst our country and its citizens, their views about data sharing. And what we found was that at the time of Hurricane Katrina and shortly afterwards, that the younger adults, they were fine. All their data was out there anyway, and so if their medical information was available, so be it. They figured somebody knew it anyway. And then people over the age of 65 were similarly, as a group, not every individual said, yeah, I'm on 10 medications. I would want that information to be available. But it was the middle that was very doubtful, very skeptical. And so I would say even across the generations that the messages will need to be tailored.
Great. Paul?
I was just going to add, I mean, I think the report was wonderful, and I think it really acknowledged all the challenges. The one thing I wanted to amplify that I think you did mention was, and I think it's one of the key learnings that the safety movement has taught us, is that no matter how diligent you are, occasionally stuff happens and you need to take responsibility for it. But you need to take responsibility in a clear, explicit, and accountable way. And that you ultimately build trust through that ability to not only prospectively plan, be as close as you can, but also recognize that this involves people and things happen. And so I think that messaging will have the same challenges as will some of the analyses that are done, frankly. So I think that it is complex. It is going to be a learning curve. We will get it right almost all the time. Nobody's perfect, and you got to have a strategy for what you do when things don't go well.
Great, thanks. Diana?
Yeah, thanks. I'm Diana Zuckerman from the National Center for Health Research. I want to thank all of you for your perspectives. This has been very helpful. I just want to say our center supported and lobbied for Sentinel and has continued to do so, and we've worked with a lot of other nonprofits that have done so as well. So a lot of these groups and public health researchers have asked me what has the impact been so far, and that's the issue that you're talking about now. And I've always been embarrassed, having been to every one of these meetings, not to be able to answer that question. So I do think a lot of people out there want the specifics. Has Sentinel so far affected labels for any drugs? Has it affected anything pertaining to the practice of medicine with the drugs that are being studied? We don't know that. So I agree we would like a couple of simple stories, but I think we want access to that information in a bigger way. And if there hasn't been much impact yet because of all the complications that we've heard, that's fine. I think we just need to know it.
Great, thanks. Go ahead.
Thank you. Can you hear me okay?
Yeah.
Thank you. Javid Furzan, my company is Eternal Resources. I've worked in the biopharmaceutical industry for many years and did a lot of work with Pfizer in the past, including negotiating a pharmacovigilance agreement in addition to selling assets and partnering with Pfizer on certain programs. So my question is probably directed best at first to Dr. Cavazzoni in terms of if you think about the ongoing increasing activity in M&A and partnering with biotech companies and other companies for large companies such as Pfizer and other companies, and the need for tools, as you referenced, in terms of better tools or tools that are a better prioritization of what works and doesn't work, and all the various initiatives the FDA has, the UFAs, the REMS initiatives. You've got your high-value portfolio drugs, you've got your generics, you've got your biosimilars, you've got a whole hodgepodge of things that you're looking at both in-house as well as competitively and through your partners. What do you see as the real gaps out there? Because I've heard a lot about different initiatives and heard a lot about some needs with respect to prioritization of tools, but what do you see as the gaps, whether they're professional focus with respect to your dealings with other companies, or your dealings as a manufacturer with providers and payers, or the consumer? Because the consumer is key here, and there's a lot of information obviously not being captured from consumers. Thank you.
Yeah, it's a big question, and thank you for asking it. And I would probably, preamble by saying that I would prefer to talk about interfaces that need to be either built or strengthened rather than gaps. And what we have seen today is that the network is getting bigger and bigger, and we have more and more stakeholders at the table in all areas, within industry, in private, as well as public agencies. So if we think about it then, the creation of a national network and a national infrastructure could actually solve a lot of this. Because if we have that space, as to some extent, we have relied on a spontaneous adverse event system and the FDA AIRS and MedWatch as a tremendous resources to conduct surveillance, not only for FDA, but also for companies and other stakeholders. So the more we create a cohesive network, or a small number of networks that really allow multiple stakeholders to utilize data, and data that will be informative and that will directly support the goal of identifying signals, evaluate them as quickly as possible, and communicate them to the public as quickly as possible, we will have addressed a lot of these needs to either create interfaces or strengthen them, or gaps.
Yeah, and it just to sort of add to that, it seems like, as we listen to what Sentinel has created, but more, leveraging that and partnering with PCORI, the NIH Collaboratory, the VA's doing a lot as an example. It seems like we're building towards that learning healthcare system, and the approach that's being taken is based off of the sort of the high priority questions. So number one, FDA needing a better system or additional tools to add to their toolbox. CDRH also, with the unique data issues with devices, has had a sort of a gap in being able to link device exposures to long-term outcomes outside of the very expensive registry process. And so that gap has sort of launched the need for energy and resources into the National Medical Device Evaluation System, the need to get better opportunities to do research for questions that are most important to patients, as an example for PCORI. And it doesn't look like we have additional questions, but maybe one last final question to the panel is, this appears to be somewhat of a coordinated effort towards a learning healthcare system. And if you all react to maybe the previous session, where we heard a lot of pilot projects, examples of where we're broadening the uses, broadening the application, but doing so in a deliberative fashion, not absent of appropriate methodologic research and validation, et cetera. So maybe the question is, are we going about this the right way to get towards a learning healthcare system?
Maybe I'll start. I think that the key word is deliberate and systematic. Ergo the strength of collaborative networks, where we might not be well served if we end up having a myriad of disparate initiatives that ultimately don't touch each other. The other important aspect, and this speaks to also how we communicate about new tools in the toolbox in safety surveillance to any stakeholder, is really frame every tool and every modality is as being part of a bigger picture. We always have to, we know that this is, the safety surveillance work is multimodal, both when it comes to methodologies as well as data sources. And it is very much in the interest of providing answers that actually are meaningful to patients and providers to really always keep in mind that bigger context and the benefit risk, context.
Paul?
I think one thing to follow closely is the work that Picori's been doing with working with a variety of delivery system leaders to say, what would it really take for us to be relevant to your business needs? And if you haven't read those reports, it was actually quite harsh, the feedback about timeliness and problem formulation and so there's a variety of shared learning there, I think, for all of us around if we want to be sustainable, if we want to be patient relevant, and we want to be business relevant, we probably need to listen to those parties. And we need to create dialogues and recognize that they aren't just stakeholders, they actually are it. So I think we're still a little superficial in how we want to convince stakeholders that we got it right, rather than asking stakeholders what they need and using that in the design. And those are fundamentally different exercises.
Great. Any other comments?
I think keeping lines of communication open and making sure they're not several disparate programs that are ongoing. I think that's the key, and I think that's already coming to fruition where there's a lot more open communication to make sure that programs that are like are being merged, or at least open lines of communication are open.
Okay, Doris?
Yeah, no, I appreciate how deliberate things have been, especially the transparency and the discussion of IMEDs and the idea that all the data or all the results would be, transparent. One thing I would ask is that consumers be involved at all levels. So if there could be a consumer involved at that board level, the governance of that organization, I think that would be ideal.
And I would just add again the word curation, that there is so much information that if it's important to my practice and to the patients that I take care of, then I want tools to be able to curate and be able to identify what it is that I'm interested in and what I need to know about, because there will be other things that are just so far away from my real world practice that they won't be relevant and I might miss the needle for the haystack.
Great. Oh, okay. Well, thank you all to the panelists for this session. It was a terrific discussion, and so thank you. And we'll invite Mark up for the final wrap up.
I do want to thank all of our panelists, this panel and throughout the day, for some tremendous presentations and great perspectives on what else needs to happen. Clearly, in the past 8 years, Sentinel has been a long way. Lots to talk about, lots of accomplishments, but I think one of the things I've noticed with these meetings is that the further you go, the more progress you make, the greater future potential and the greater the amount of work ahead seems to be. And we had a lot of discussion today about how to build on the progress to date to make the Sentinel system an even more effective and integral part of learning and developing evidence that's relevant for everyone in our healthcare system. We talked about making progress on further technical issues, common data model expansions, incorporation of new types of clinical and patient-reported data. We also talked about further progress toward this network model that is able to address questions about safety and effectiveness of medical products, including devices, much more effectively, and that is synergistic with other efforts to get to a learning healthcare system, one with, as the panel was just discussing, not just something in it for everyone, but designed deliberately to be as effective and efficient as possible answering important questions in a timely way. So there also was discussion about more work needing to be done around the engagement of the public and patients. Earlier on, when Sentinel was more in the mini stage and wasn't doing quite so much, maybe a reason why people were busy, were not able to, or not as interested in paying attention to what's going on with the program. I don't think that's the case anymore, with many different inquiries being done every week, with expansions into not only more types of safety questions, but questions of effectiveness and potentially a much more integral role in FDA-related activities, as well as activities of other federal agencies and other parts of our healthcare system. So finding better ways to convey the many potential benefits for patients of getting the information and insights from this system and being part of its next steps, again, as we just discussed on the last panel, seems like a critical way of both increasing the program's impact and gaining momentum for these next steps, the accomplishments that haven't yet been made, but that could well lie in the near future. If we continue on the pace that Sentinel's been able to achieve over the last 8 years, I do see this program as being a fundamentally important driver to get to a much more effective and informed healthcare system supported by a much more informed public. I want to thank everyone who made it possible for us to get to this point in general, but particularly today with this conference. We have had a lot of active participation from those of you who are here in person. Also want to thank everyone who's joined us online, and recognize that through the website it's possible to get more information and contact us about further issues related to Sentinel. And then finally, before we adjourn, there are several people I really want to thank in particular. That goes for all of our speakers and panelists today. We've heard from leaders at FDA, from the Sentinel program, on the private side, the broader stakeholder community, a wide range of participants. We know you all are very busy, and we deeply appreciate your taking the time to share your work and your perspectives on the future, the challenges ahead, and ways to address those challenges with us today. Also want to give a special thanks to a number of the FDA staff in particular who have put a tremendous amount of effort into this program. Michael Nguyen, Carlos Bell, Aaron Neiman. They worked closely with us over the past year, and especially the past few months, to plan this event and help make sure everything came together well. And then last but certainly not least, our Duke team, Greg Daniel, Adam Otten, Pranav Arora, Joanna Klatzman, Serena Coates, I'm not out of time yet, right? And Christina Flores for all of their help in putting this event together. And again, finally, thanks to all of you for coming, for your contribution to this effort. This really is a public-private partnership. As you've heard, it's not something that FDA is doing by itself. It takes hard work and continued engagement from everyone with a stake in the better outcome for our healthcare system to make it work, and we really appreciate all you're doing to make it possible. For now, we're adjourned, and safe travels. Thank you very much.